Welcome to this self-knowledge course. Today we will see the topic, drugs and alcoholism. We will see that this conference is very important, because it will show us the urgency of eliminating these two defects in our psychology, since they make any progress in inner work impossible. And it is important to realize that all of us, to a greater or lesser degree, have nurtured these defects. But it often happens that we understand that only those we consider addicted have a problem with alcohol and drugs. But today, we are going to analyze how little by little, if we don't work on the small details that lead us to give into these defects, we will end up falling to greater and greater levels from one life to the next. In addition, and it is another of the objectives of this conference, we will understand that by reflecting on and eliminating these defects within us, we will know how to help people affected by these two defects to regenerate. We are going to see that no matter how deep we have fallen into drugs or alcohol, we can get out of it, and today we are going to see how we can do it. Let's start talking about alcoholism. And to make an objective understanding of this subject, we are going to approach this defect of alcoholism for what it really is: a very strong and very subtle demon, which slowly and pleasantly attracts and traps us, until it manages to dominate and submit us. We are going to study and understand what the mottos of this psychological entity are, its characteristics, and the physical, psychological, and spiritual consequences that it brings us. We need to understand that all drug addiction and alcoholism processes on this planet, and within each one of us, are driven by a defect, a force, or concentration of negative energy, so strong that it is actually a demon. This demon is known by the name of alcohol. Alcohol is one of the 10 most evil demons on planet Earth. It represents the head of Medusa, cut off by Perseus. Alcohol was the winner of the contest among the main demons of the planet for being the one that originates the most degeneration in the race, and is related to something that is so common for us today, which is alcohol. But alcohol is one of the fastest ways to lower our level of consciousness, and has been used as a tool to keep human consciousness in a low state for thousands of years. The dictators of all times, the tyrants, do not ignore that it is easier to govern and enslave a town of drinkers than a town of teetotalers. So, let's see the mottos and characteristics that define this demon, and how these are fulfilled in our lives when we let ourselves be carried away by this defect. The first motto of this demon is, "I am the owner of the planet." And we can easily see that alcoholism is one of the biggest causes of heinous accidents and crimes that we see on the planet. But at the same time, we can also see that we can freely find it everywhere. Absolutely all of us, in one way or another, frequently face a situation that leads us to consume alcohol. Since it is present in any social or business meeting, at a birthday party, at meals, and generally, when we think of distracting ourselves, relaxing, and have fun, alcohol is present. Thus, we see how slowly and seductively this demon has been taking over the planet. Since at this moment, it is very rare to find someone who doesn't consume alcohol, even to a minimal degree. And we can even see how young people, and even children, are being faced with the temptation to consume alcohol or drugs. Another of his mottos is, "I am the thief of the solar atoms." And this is because both alcohol and drugs rot the sexual creative energy, converting its solar atoms into involutionary lunar atoms, thus making any progress in inner work impossible. Another of his mottos is, "I am the father of corruption and misfortune." And it is totally like that, any sense of ethics and morality relaxes, and becomes distorted, after a few good drinks. We also see that the greatest cause of car accidents is represented by driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Another motto is, "I am the father of degeneration and vice." And it's very interesting to see, and I think it's one of those subtle ways in which this demon traps us, and it's that we think we can control it. We tend to think that those who fall into vices are weak people, but that we are not. And that is how we are giving in to consuming a little, then a little more. Little by little we go taking a liking to it, and we start incorporating it, more and more, into our lives. And this tends to happen little by little, so we don't realize how suddenly we are consuming alcohol too often, but it has become normal to us. But what happens? As we have been seeing in the different conferences, we live many lives as humans. And every time our physical body dies, our psychological defects, which are the ones that have trapped 97% of our essence, do not die, but return in the next life to express themselves again in us, to continue growing and becoming stronger, and to submit us more and more. Hence the need to stop and eliminate these defects regardless of the level of consumption we have. Regardless of whether we believe we can control them. With drugs and alcohol, we must not make compromises or negotiations, we must radically eliminate them. And another of his mottos is, "I am the destroyer of homes." And it is all too common to see how domestic violence is often based on its consumption. How this defect brings out in a person their cruelest selves, capable of hurting, and even killing, those they supposedly love the most. It is very important to reflect on the consequences of this defect to realize that definitely it is the cause of misery and ruin. And as dictated by another of its mottos, it poisons our reason until it ends up destroying us. Now, let's look at some of its characteristics. One of them is that it lubricates the wheel of samsara. As I explained before, when we first created these defects, we generated a recurrence. And in each existence, at the same age, and sometimes earlier, it will manifest itself again. And each time we surrender to the desire to consume, this defect grows and becomes stronger. And each time it subdues us more, enslaves us more, and it destroys us faster, so it leads us to die sooner. If we have the opportunity in each cycle to 108 existences to achieve self-realization, but we do not eliminate this defect, then, if in one existence we die due to this defect at 50 years old, in the next existence we get hooked faster, and consume more, consequently, we no longer reach 50, and at 40 we die. And so on, our existences are shortened, and therefore, our possibilities of achieving self-realization are exhausted faster. Another of its characteristics is that it insinuates itself everywhere, always tempting. We must begin to observe, and become aware, of how alcohol is everywhere. Even at a children's party, there is no shortage of alcohol for adults. Giving children the signal, from an early age, that drinking alcohol is okay, and that it is something to what to aspire to, when they grow up. If we think about it, it was early in our lives when the morbid curiosity to try alcohol was planted in us, because we saw the adults drinking and having fun, but without realizing the consequences it entailed. But we also see that alcohol can be disguised as something very fine and diplomatic. And we feel very sophisticated drinking expensive liquors. However, it's just this demon's way of dressing up with elegance and sophistication, to make himself look desirable, and make us feel like we need him. Another interesting of its characteristics is that he seems to have the talent of ubiquity. Thus, we see how everywhere, regardless of social class, age, sex, or race, we can find it. Let's now see the consequences that the defect of alcoholism brings us. Beyond the physical and psychological consequences that this defect brings us and that are widely known, like how it terribly damages the liver, the esophagus, the pancreas, how it damages the sexual apparatus generating impotence, and how it brings congenital malformations, or how it affects the ability of concentration, etc. Let's look at the spiritual consequences, since these are, shall we say, less well known. One is that it kills off the possibilities of being, so, we see that, in relation to self-realization, which is our true objective in this existence, it will be totally impossible if we do not radically eliminate the defect of alcoholism. Since it doesn't allow us to advance in inner work, because it prevents us from advancing in the work with the three factors of the revolution of consciousness. Since alcohol damages our sexual energy, for that reason it revives dead defects. In other words, every time we consume alcohol, we will lose the progress we are making in psychological death. And as it damages our sexual energy, it prevents us from achieving chastity, and even more, it leads us to the worst vile things in sex. As this defect gives way to expressing our heaviest defects of lust, a person who is drinking falls much more easily into fornication, adultery, even promiscuity, orgies, and sexual practices to which perhaps they would never consent, being sober. We also see how it dulls the senses, how the morale relaxes, and in a state of intoxication, one is more influenced by any suggestion. This defect increases weakness, so it robs us of that revolutionary force that leads us to deny our desires. Under the influence of alcohol, we easily fall into ill will, and give in more easily to the temptation of any defect, of any kind. But it also stimulates fantasy, and for this reason the person does not see life objectively. They do not even see the consequences of their actions. They let themselves be carried away by pleasure, without reflecting on how it ruins and shortens their life. In addition to curtailing their own possibilities of some spiritual growth, this defect develops irresponsibility and non-compliance. It also weakens the ethical sense. It destroys the human part of the individual, it animalizes it. And to recover that sensitivity, that control over his own mind and emotion, the person must purify himself and work on himself. We must understand that the consequences of pleasure are always pain, inevitably. And if we do not learn to deny ourselves those pleasures that alcohol gives us, nothing will prevent us from having to face the pain of its physical, mental, and spiritual consequences. There are some important warnings to keep in mind in relation to these defects. The first is that we must be radical. We cannot think of leaving it little by little, believing that we will be able to consume less, or only on special occasions. Since this demon is very treacherous and when we least expect it, it stabs us in the back, making us fall lower than before. And something very important is, that if we are teaching this knowledge to other people, we have a responsibility to set an example for the people who listen to our teachings. With this demon it is not possible to make compromises, or arrangements, of any kind. So, to eradicate this defect we must be radical, not a single drop more. Now we are going to talk a little about drugs, and then, we are going to explain the concrete steps to eliminate these two defects in a radical way. The scourge of drugs is even stronger than alcoholism. As it produces much more pleasure in the person, the consequences are also stronger, and are perceived in a shorter term. People get hooked much more easily, and when they want to quit, they feel totally weak in the face of this defect. They try repeatedly and fall again, and each failure to quit reaffirms that weakness. To understand that it's entirely possible for each of us to get off drugs, no matter how hooked we are, or how long we've been using, it's important to understand the psychological unfolding. It is important to verify that there are two men within us. The outer man and the inner man. The outer man is that egoic way of being with multiple attitudes and reactions, with which we commonly express ourselves in this outer world, which is nothing more than a puppet moved by invisible strings that are each of our psychological defects. The outer man represents our weakness, the one who always feels badly paid, who feels sorry for himself, who considers himself too much, and feels weak before this or any defect. We think that this outer man is all we are, but the psychological unfolding shows us the reality of the inner man. The inner man is our authentic being, it is processed in other very different laws, he could never be turned into a robot by the psychological defects. When we manage to discover and recognize within us that particular warrior, that source of strength, wisdom, and love that resides in the consciousness of each one of us, then we try to act in life, according to the fundamental principles that we carry deep within our being. For our being, eliminating the defect of drugs or alcohol is not difficult. Our being understands that these defects have trapped a large part of our consciousness and wisdom, and that facing and eliminating them will result in great strength and encouragement for inner work. Since we will rescue all the encouragement, that we currently have to feed the defect by denying ourselves to desire, and imposing the will of consciousness on the will of the defect. Thus, we are going to rescue the fire and the spirit, which were previously subject to the defect, but which now will work towards consciousness, and towards the liberation of all our consciousness. And all the understanding and wisdom that we rescue will help us to help others to get out of that slavery. Since each defect that we understand and eliminate brings us a wisdom, which is our own wisdom, it is a knowledge of oneself. And whoever has eliminated these defects can more easily help others to get out of there. If we do not recognize that divine upper part in ourselves, it will be difficult for us to face these and any defect. We will feel weak, incapable. In order for that inner man, that we all carry inside, to begin to manifest, we must first be able to recognize our own nothingness and inner misery. And that happens when we have the courage to review our life, and to look and face our own mistakes. And we must also develop conscious faith, which is the faith that is obtained through the practice and direct experience of this knowledge. Discovering and experiencing a real connection with our being, with that higher part within ourselves, will allow us to know and to differentiate a real superior spiritual experience from what happens when a person takes drugs. When a person takes drugs, enters an altered state of consciousness, that although he could think that it is something superior, something conscious, it is not. It will never be possible to connect with the higher parts of our consciousness, in a state of hypnotic hallucination, which is what drugs produce. Let's look at this. In the 60s, the age of Aquarius began under the regency of Uranus. Since then, the Dionysian wave vibrates intensely throughout nature. We can define Dionysus like this: voluntary transmutation of the sexual libido, mystical transcendental ecstasy. However, it is evident that earthlings, for the most part, could not become positively polarized with such a wave. The Dionysian positive pole brings subliminal sexual delight, voluntary transmutation of the seminal entity, awakened consciousness, objective knowledge, superlative intuition, transcendental music of the great classical masters, etc. While the Dionysian negative pole brings sexual degeneration, infrasexualism of all kinds, homosexuality, lesbianism, demonic pleasures in the infernal worlds through drugs, mushrooms, alcohol, hellish music, etc. Arriving at this part, it becomes necessary for us to differentiate the Dionysian drunkenness, which is only achieved through meditation, and which is what allows us to experience ecstasy, samadhi, and these are obviously essential when it comes to experiencing what is the truth and the real. Such exaltation is 100% possible through the meditation technique. We must differentiate it from psychedelia. Psychedelia is the opposite. The psychedelic is the antithesis of meditation. It is a state of negative alteration of the state of consciousness, where infradimensional vibrations are perceived. That is to say, that the experiences that are had through psychedelia come from the lower dimensions, and never come from the higher dimensions, nor from the spiritual part in our interior. The hell of drugs is inside the planet where we live, under the very epidermis of the Earth's crust. Hallucinogenic mushrooms, pills, LSD, marijuana, ayahuasca, peyote, etc., evidently intensify the vibratory capacity of subjective powers, but it is obvious that they can never cause the awakening of consciousness. Meditation and psychedelia are incompatible, opposed, antagonistic, they could never mix. In addition to this, drug use brings us many terrible consequences. We will see that they bring us the same consequences of alcoholism, but in addition to this. In relation to the physical body, they affect the sexual apparatus, causing the person to reach sexual impotence soon. We also see how quickly the physical body degenerates and is destroyed, since a young man, who begins to take drugs, in a short time, becomes a decrepit old man. Drugs fundamentally alter the sex genes, and this is already scientifically proven. If we take a look at the vital or etheric body, the vital body of an ordinary person looks resplendent, brilliant. On the other hand, in a drug addict it fades, that vital part disintegrates, it loses its shine, until it ends up looking like a corpse. We know that the vital body is what vitalizes, or gives life, and repairs the physical body at times when the body rests or sleeps. If we lose the vital part, it is logical that we are on the edge of the cemetery. If we go to the fifth dimension, we see the astral body of the drug addict walking around like an idiot, like a madman running wild, doing and undoing. And if we look inside that astral body, what we call the ego, the demons that we carry within us, they are in a great feast. Why? Because through drugs we feed those psychic elements that we should destroy. Drug is food for them. Also, terrible damages can be seen in the mental body. Since alpha rays are annihilated, so the intrinsic connection between mind and brain is lost and the person loses the ability to concentrate. If we examine the brain of a drug addict, we can see the brain tissue of the mental body completely destroyed. And in the causal body we can see how the essence suffers the consequences of the drugs, since the consciousness is seen dulled, like a drunk looking for where to fall. Here we can see, not only the three-dimensional damage, but the internal damage that drugs cause to a person who is dedicated to its consumption. That is serious. Since we have widely seen the characteristics and consequences of these two defects, let's see how we can eliminate them. The first step to eliminate these defects is to have the desire and the courage to do it. It is impossible to force someone who doesn't want to give up the habit to quit. So, in order for someone really remove these defects in a definitive way, they must feel the desire to change, the desire to work on themselves, and to achieve their own self-realization. Then, if the person is interested in changing and getting out of the situation they are in, they should start by self-observing, in order to discover in themselves each of the desires and emotions that are related to alcohol or drugs. Let's remember that self-observation is to always direct our attention towards ourselves, to discover the defects that want to manifest in us. So, the person must self-observe each desire that these defects make them feel. They must maintain a constant vigil to observe and discover each of those desires, but also those emotions of displeasure, anxiety, and despair, that it causes them to make them feel weak and so that they agree to consume. They must also observe each of the justifications for drinking or using drugs, such as, "This is the last time. One more and that's it." Or, "I'm only going to accompany that person, but I'm not going to drink or consume." Or, "It's only for that occasion, because it's a special occasion." Those or any of the thousands of justifications with which the defect can speak to our minds so that we give up and feed it. And they must also observe each of the acts of ill will to do what the defect wants. We must stay alert to constantly observe all this. And for each one of the discoveries that they make through self-observation, they should beg their particular Divine Mother to eliminate the detail, the desire, the sensation, or the thought, in relation to these defects, that is having at that moment. We are going to refuse to do the will of the defect. And if we don't please the defect, and do the process of psychological death every time the desire arises, in a relatively short time, we will begin to dominate that psychological defect. Now, if the person is too hooked, if he feels that the defect is too strong, he can do the practice of negotiation with the law, which we learned in the last conference, laws of karma and dharma. And in this negotiation, he is going to ask that the defect be imprisoned, and he is going to commit himself to work on that defect with psychological death every day, until it is eliminated. And he could also commit himself to help others, giving them this knowledge, so that they can also free themselves. When the defect is internally imprisoned, it manifests itself in the person in a minimal portion, so that they can work on it. And to the extent that they reflect, understand, eliminate, and refuse to do the will of the self, will gain more strength. Then another portion of the defect will be released, and then another, until it is completely eliminated. This practice is highly recommended to do in these cases. Another recommendation, and one that seems very important to me, is to get out of the circle of friends with whom we usually drink or use drugs. Since to eliminate this defect, we will need all our willpower, and if we continue frequenting the same places, and the same people with whom we used to consume, we will constantly be faced with temptation. At first, we might believe that we will be alone, but this is not real. By eliminating these defects, our level of being will rise, and therefore, by law of affinity, just as before we attracted drunkards and drug addicts around us, now we will attract people with a higher vibration. And something that helps a lot to detoxify the body and regenerate neurons are the practices of the dances of the dervishes and the energy sublimation practice. The dance of the dervishes are exercises that help us unload and detoxify the liver, as well as align the three brains. We will see that practice in later lectures. The energy sublimation is the practice that consists of covering the right nostril while inhaling, imagining how the energy rises from the right sexual gonad, as we see in the graph, up to the brain, and we exhale through the mouth. The left nostril is then covered, and as we inhale, the energy rises from the left gonad to the brain, and is exhaled through the mouth, and this is repeated for a maximum of 10 minutes. To get the most out of these practices, it is good to do them in the early hours of the morning, since the air is purer. Hopefully we will have the facility to go out into an open space like a park, and do it accompanied by someone. And as we recover, if we have a partner, it is important to start practicing sexual transmutation, to start regenerating the physical body with sexual energy, while working on psychological death, eliminating all those details that once enslaved us. Another thing that is very important is to understand that in general, the cause of one falling into vices is leisure. As the old saying goes, leisure is the mother of all vices. Therefore, it is important to occupy our time in constructive things. One of the ways to enter in unlimited occupation is the sacrifice for humanity. If the person who regenerating himself helps others to awaken their consciousness, by law of correspondence, he will have the right to be helped internally. And finally, something very important that we must do is meditate on these defects. So, we must invest part of our daily time in reflective meditation. Throughout the day we will be working with psychological death, eliminating desires, justifications, and ill will, thus denying ourselves to fall into the desires of the defect. And also, we will dedicate a few hours every day to reflect, to meditate on the different moments in our lives when these defects manifested in us. So, we will bring to meditation those scenes experienced with these defects to continue finding more of its details, and we can deepen on the defect by asking ourselves things like, how far has this defect led me? Be it alcoholism or drugs. How has it damaged my physical body? How has it damaged my relationship with my family, with my friends, with work, with other people in general? But above all, how has it damaged the relationship with my inner being, with my consciousness? Also, we must reflect on the number of psychological conflicts that the defect has brought us in this existence, and how it has influenced our degeneration. We are going to start reflecting on all these things in order to extract more and more details and eliminate them, and to arrive at more and more understandings, and have more strength to face these defects. When a person realizes all the damage it has caused him, how it has damaged his sexual apparatus, causing him impotence, how it has damaged his physical body, burned his brain cells, made him lose his partner, his family, etc., then that makes him have a deep need to eliminate those defects from his inner world. And let's remember that the important thing is to act in life according to the fundamental principles that we carry in the depths of the being. And this has been today's conference. I hope this information is useful for you. As always, I invite you to the next conference in which we will talk about the difference between the ego, the personality, and the essence. In that conference you will learn to differentiate when in you is acting the ego, when the personality, and when could the essence manifest in you. And this will help you a lot to improve your self-observation capacity. Don't miss that interesting topic. Until next time.